It was a cold, rainy evening when her life changed forever. At just 13 years old, she found herself standing alone on the side of a deserted road, clutching a small bag of belongings. Her heart pounded as she looked around, hoping someone would come back for her. But no one did. She had been abandoned by her own family, left to fend for herself. The reason? She was pregnant. Her family, strict and traditional, couldn't accept the shame they felt she had brought upon them. They had given her an ultimatum: leave the house and never return, or face the consequences. Terrified and with nowhere to go, she chose to leave. As she walked aimlessly in the rain, tears mixed with the droplets on her face. She was just a child, but now she had to grow up faster than she ever imagined. The days that followed were a blur. She wandered from place to place, sleeping on park benches and eating whatever she could find. She was scared, not just for herself but for the baby growing inside her. She knew she had to find shelter, but who would take in a pregnant teenager? One day, exhausted and hungry, she stumbled upon a small community center. A kind woman working there noticed her and immediately offered help. She gave her food, a warm blanket, and a safe place to rest. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. The woman introduced her to a local shelter that supported young mothers in need. There, she found a temporary home and met others who had faced similar struggles. She wasn't alone anymore. The shelter provided her with prenatal care, counseling, and even helped her continue her education. Slowly, she began to rebuild her life. She learned how to take care of herself and prepare for the baby's arrival. It wasn't easy, but she was determined to give her child a better life than she had. Months passed, and the day finally came when she gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. Holding her daughter for the first time, she felt a love she had never known before. It was a love that gave her strength and purpose. She knew she had to keep fighting, not just for herself but for her baby. She worked hard, taking on small jobs while continuing her studies. Life was still tough, but she refused to give up. Years went by, and she managed to create a stable life for herself and her daughter. She had built a small but loving home, and her daughter was thriving. But deep down, she still carried the pain of being abandoned by her family. She often wondered what had become of them and if they ever thought about her. Little did she know, her past was about to catch up with her in a way she never expected. One ordinary day, as she was walking her daughter to school, she noticed a familiar face in the crowd. Her heart skipped a beat. It was someone from her past, someone she never thought she'd see again. The encounter would change everything, setting off a chain of events that would reveal a shocking twist she could never have imagined. The familiar face in the crowd was her older brother. He looked different, older, more tired, but she recognized him instantly. Her stomach churned as memories of that rainy night flooded back. She froze, unsure whether to approach him or turn away. Before she could decide, their eyes met. He stopped in his tracks, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. "Is that you?" he stammered, his voice trembling. She nodded slowly, clutching her daughter's hand tighter. Her brother's eyes darted to the little girl, and his face softened. "This is your child?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded again, her throat too tight to speak. For a moment, they just stood there, the weight of years of silence hanging between them. Finally, her brother broke the tension. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. She hesitated, unsure if she was ready to face the past. But curiosity and a faint hope for closure pushed her to agree. They arranged to meet later that evening at a quiet cafe. As she sat across from her brother that night, she felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and a strange sense of longing. He began to explain what had happened after she left. Their parents had been devastated, though they never admitted it. The shame they felt had clouded their judgment, and by the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. They had searched for her but couldn't find her. Over time, guilt and regret consumed them. Her brother's voice cracked as he spoke. They never stop thinking about you. Mom, she cried every night. Dad became a shell of himself. They wanted to make things right, but they didn't know how. She listened in silence, tears streaming down her face. Part of her wanted to forgive them, but another part still felt the sting of abandonment. Then her brother dropped the bombshell. Dad passed away last year, he said quietly. And Mom, she's not well. She's been asking for you. She wants to see you before it's too late. Her heart ached at the news. She had spent years building a life without them, but now, faced with the possibility of losing her mother forever, she felt torn. Could she forgive them? Should she? And what would it mean for her daughter, who had never known her grandparents? As she left the cafe that night, her mind raced. The past had come knocking, and she knew she couldn't ignore it. But reopening old wounds would come with risks. Little did she know, the journey ahead would uncover secrets that would change everything she thought she knew about her family, and herself. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. She couldn't stop thinking about her brother's words. Her mother was sick, and time was running out. She wrestled with the decision, should she go back and face the family that had abandoned her, or should she protect herself and her daughter from potential heartbreak? Her daughter, now a bright and curious 8-year-old, noticed her mother's distraction. Mom, are you okay? Her daughter asked one evening, looking up from her coloring book. She forced a smile and nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. I'm just thinking about some grown-up stuff, she replied. But her daughter, wise beyond her years, pressed further. Is it about your family? The one you never talk about? Her heart ached at the question. She had always been honest with her daughter, but she had never gone into detail about her past. Now, she realized it was time to explain. She sat her daughter down and told her the story, how she had been young and scared, how her family had turned their backs on her, and how she had worked hard to build a life for the two of them. Her daughter listened quietly, her small hand gripping her mother's. Do you want to see them again? Her daughter asked softly. She hesitated, then nodded. I think I need to. For me, and for you. Her daughter smiled. Then we should go. I want to meet my grandma. With her daughter's encouragement, she made the decision to visit her mother. She reached out to her brother, who arranged the meeting. A week later, they found themselves standing outside the house she had once called home. It looked smaller than she remembered, worn down by time. Her heart raced as she knocked on the door. Her brother answered, his face a mix of relief and anxiety. He led them inside, where her mother sat in a wheelchair by the window. The sight took her breath away. Her mother, once strong and stern, now looked frail and fragile. Her eyes lit up when she saw her daughter, and tears streamed down her face. You came, her mother whispered, her voice trembling. She knelt beside the wheelchair, taking her mother's hand. I'm here, she said softly. Her mother's gaze shifted to her granddaughter, who stood shyly by the door. And this is, her mother asked, her voice filled with wonder. Your granddaughter, she replied, her voice breaking. Her mother reached out, and her daughter stepped forward, taking her grandmother's hand. The room was filled with a silence that spoke volumes, regret, forgiveness, and the beginning of healing. But as they sat together, sharing stories and tears, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her family's story than she knew. Something her mother and brother weren't telling her. And soon, she would discover a secret that would change everything. The visit with her mother was bittersweet. For the first time in years, she felt a connection to her family, but there was an undercurrent of tension she couldn't ignore. Her mother's health was declining, and though she tried to make the most of their time together, there were moments when her mother would hesitate, as if holding something back. Her brother, too, seemed uneasy, often exchanging glances with their mother that made her wonder what they weren't saying. One evening, after her daughter had gone to bed, she sat with her mother in the quiet living room. The air was heavy with unspoken words. Finally, she broke the silence. "Mom, there's something you're not telling me, isn't there?" Her mother looked away, her hands trembling in her lap. After a long pause, she nodded. "There's something you need to know," her mother began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." Her heart raced as she leaned closer, bracing herself for what was coming. Her mother took a deep breath and continued. "When you were born, I wasn't ready to be a mother. I was young and scared, just like you were when you had your daughter. I gave you up for adoption." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She stared at her mother, unable to process what she was hearing. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice shaking. Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "I gave you to a family who couldn't have children. But a year later, I regretted it. I fought to get you back, and eventually, I did. But I never told you the truth. I was too ashamed." She felt a mix of emotions, shock, anger, and confusion. All her life, she had believed these people were her biological family, but now she didn't know who she was. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, her voice breaking. Her mother reached for her hand. "Because you deserve to know the truth. And because, there's more." Her brother, who had been quietly listening, stepped forward. "The family who adopted you, they've been looking for you," he said. "They reached out to us a few years ago, but we didn't know how to tell you. We thought it would be too much." She felt her world spinning. Not only had she been abandoned once, but her entire identity was now in question. Who were her real parents? And why had they waited so long to find her? As she sat there, overwhelmed by the revelations, she realized her journey was far from over. The truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. The revelation left her reeling. She spent the next few days in a daze, trying to make sense of everything. Her mother's confession had shattered the foundation of her identity. The people she had called family her entire life weren't her biological parents. And now, there was another family out there, strangers who had been searching for her. Her daughter, perceptive as always, noticed her distress. "Mom, what's wrong?" she asked one morning, her small face filled with concern. She hesitated, then decided it was time to be honest. She explained everything, how her mother had given her up for adoption, how she had been brought back, and how her biological family might still be looking for her. Her daughter listened intently, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Do you want to find them?" her daughter asked. The question lingered in the air. Did she? Part of her was angry and hurt, unsure if she could handle another emotional upheaval. But another part of her was curious. Who were these people? Why had they given her up? And why were they looking for her now? With her daughter's encouragement, she decided to take the first step. She reached out to her brother, who had the contact information for the family who had adopted her. It felt strange, asking him for help after everything that had happened, but he seemed eager to make amends. "I'll support you, no matter what you decide," he said. A few days later, she found herself staring at an email address, the only link to the family she had never known. Her hands trembled as she typed out a message, introducing herself and explaining her situation. She hesitated before hitting send, her heart pounding. What if they didn't want to meet her? What if this opened old wounds for them too? To her surprise, she received a reply within hours. The message was warm and heartfelt, filled with emotion. They had been searching for her for years, hoping for a chance to reconnect. They shared details about their lives, where they lived, what they did, and how they had never stopped thinking about her. They also explained why they had given her up, a story filled with heartbreak and difficult choices. As she read their words, tears streamed down her face. For the first time, she felt a connection to these strangers, a sense of belonging she hadn't realized she was missing. They wanted to meet her, and after some thought, she agreed. They arranged to meet at a neutral location, a small park halfway between their homes. The day of the meeting arrived, and she felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. Her daughter held her hand tightly as they walked toward the park. She had no idea what to expect, but she knew one thing for certain: her life was about to change forever. The park was quiet, with only the sound of rustling leaves and distant chatter filling the air. She held her daughter's hand tightly as they approached the bench where they had agreed to meet. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel her palms sweating. What would they be like? Would they regret reaching out? Would she regret coming here? As they got closer, she saw them, a couple sitting side by side, their faces filled with nervous anticipation. The woman had kind eyes and a warm smile, while the man looked serious but gentle. They stood up as she approached, their expressions a mix of hope and fear. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the woman stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "It's really you," she whispered, her voice trembling. She nodded, unable to find the words. The woman reached out, hesitating for a moment before pulling her into a tight hug. It was an embrace filled with years of longing and regret, and despite her initial hesitation, she found herself hugging back. The man stood nearby, his eyes glistening with tears. "We've waited so long for this moment," he said, his voice choked with emotion. She looked at him, then at the woman, and felt a strange sense of familiarity. These were her biological parents, the people who had given her life but had been absent from it for so long. They sat down on the bench, and the couple began to share their story. They had been young and unprepared when she was born, facing pressures and circumstances that made them feel they had no choice but to give her up. It was a decision that had haunted them ever since. They had tried to find her over the years, but the adoption records were sealed, and they had hit dead ends. It wasn't until recently that they had finally gotten a lead, which led them to her brother. As they spoke, she listened intently, her emotions swirling. She felt anger, sadness, and empathy all at once. Her daughter, sitting quietly beside her, reached for her hand, offering silent support. "We don't expect you to forgive us," the woman said, her voice breaking. "We just wanted you to know that we've always loved you and that we're so proud of the person you've become." She looked at them, her heart heavy but also filled with a strange sense of peace. She didn't know if she could fully forgive them, but she understood their pain. And for the first time, she felt a connection to her past, a missing piece of her identity finally falling into place. As they left the park that day, she knew this was just the beginning. There were still questions to be answered and wounds to heal, but for now, she felt a glimmer of hope. Her journey wasn't over, but she was no longer walking it alone. The meeting with her biological parents left her with more questions than answers, but it also opened a door she hadn't known was closed. Over the following weeks, they stayed in touch, exchanging messages and phone calls. Slowly, she began to piece together the story of her early life, how her biological parents had struggled, how they had made the painful decision to give her up, and how they had spent years searching for her. Her adoptive family, the ones who had raised her, were supportive but cautious. Her mother, now frail and bedridden, apologized repeatedly for keeping the truth from her. "I was selfish," she admitted one evening, her voice weak but sincere. "I was afraid of losing you, and I didn't want to share you with anyone else." She forgave her, understanding that fear and love had driven her actions. Her daughter, curious and full of questions, became a bridge between the two families. She would ask about her grandparents, both sets, and share stories about her life with them. It was heartwarming to see how easily children could adapt and accept, unburdened by the weight of past mistakes. One day, her biological parents invited her and her daughter to their home. It was a small, cozy house filled with photographs and memories. As she walked through the rooms, she noticed a picture on the mantel, a baby photo she had never seen before. "That's you," her biological mother said, smiling softly. "It's the only picture we have from before." Her voice trailed off, but the meaning was clear. They spent the day together, sharing meals and stories. Her biological father showed her old family albums, pointing out relatives she had never known existed. "You have your grandmother's eyes," he said, his voice filled with pride. She felt a sense of belonging she hadn't realized she was missing. But amidst the warmth and connection, there was still a lingering question. Why had they waited so long to find her? Her biological mother hesitated before answering. "We tried," she said, her voice trembling. "But every time we got close, something stopped us. Fear, guilt, shame. We didn't know if you'd want to see us. It wasn't until we realized time was running out that we finally took the leap." The answer resonated deeply with her. She, too, had lived with fear and hesitation, unsure of whether to confront her past. But now, she felt a sense of closure, not just for herself, but for her daughter, who deserved to know where she came from. As they left that day, she felt a strange sense of peace. The journey had been painful and complicated, but it had also brought her closer to understanding who she was. And as she looked at her daughter, she knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. Life began to settle into a new rhythm. She continued to build a relationship with her biological parents, visiting them regularly and introducing them to her adoptive family. It wasn't always easy, there were moments of tension and awkwardness, but they all worked through it, united by a shared desire to heal and move forward. Her adoptive mother's health continued to decline, but she spent as much time with her as possible, cherishing the moments they had left. One evening, as they sat together, her mother held her hand and said, "I'm so proud of you. You've become so strong, so kind. I know I made mistakes, but I hope you know how much I love you." Tears filled her eyes as she squeezed her mother's hand. "I know, Mom. And I love you too." Her daughter thrived in the midst of it all, forming bonds with both sets of grandparents. She would often say, "I have so many people who love me," and her joy was contagious. It reminded her that, despite the pain and confusion of the past, love had always been at the center of her story. One day, her biological parents asked if they could meet her adoptive family. It was a big step, but she agreed, hoping it would bring closure for everyone. The meeting was emotional, filled with tears and apologies, but also laughter and gratitude. They all realized that, in their own ways, they had been trying to do what was best for her. As time went on, she began to see her life in a new light. The abandonment, the secrets, the struggles, they had shaped her, but they didn't define her. She had built a life filled with love, resilience, and hope, and she was proud of the person she had become. Years later, as she watched her daughter graduate from school, surrounded by both sets of grandparents, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had brought her to this moment, a moment of unity, love, and celebration. She realized that life wasn't about avoiding pain or hiding from the past. It was about facing it, learning from it, and finding the strength to move forward. And as she looked at the people who had become her family, both by blood and by choice, she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The story that had begun with abandonment and heartbreak had turned into one of forgiveness, connection, and love. And though there would always be scars, they were a reminder of how far she had come, and how much she had to be thankful for.